Right, multilateralism at stake. Let's make sense of the developments as they unfold at the United Nations in New York. Bringing SABC News international editor Sophie Mokoena with us here in our studios in Johannesburg. And great to see you as always, Sophie. Thanks very much indeed for popping by. Very important meetings for the president today. Perhaps let's just recap what took place yesterday as we take stock of perhaps these bilateral engagements that lie ahead.
Well, of course, yesterday, as you saw, the president also had meetings with other important leaders on the margins of the summit for the future. He met the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, and you know that I think high on the agenda was issues around peace and security. As you know that South Africa is assisting in the DRC, you have a situation in Sudan, but also the Middle East question that would include the conflict in Ukraine, because these are the areas where South Africa is also involved. And the other important issue, there is a summit today. The G20 leaders will be meeting on the margins of the UN General Assembly. Now, with the G20, Antonio Guterres would be lobbying, or maybe he was lobbying a country like South Africa, which is part of the G20, in relation with these reforms on issues related to financial institutions. As you heard him saying that your IMF, your World Bank, they've reached a ceiling in terms of their mandate because it was not geared to assist countries that are in distress, particularly from the developing nations, because it was this system was meant to rebuild, and it was geared to rebuilding of the developed North, those who were involved in the Second World War. So I think those were the issues that the president would have engaged Antonio Guterres on. And then he had also a meeting with the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court from The Hague. You know that South Africa did approach the International Court for its intervention in terms of those who are responsible for the death of many Palestinians in the Middle East, particularly in relation to the Gaza war. And therefore, maybe they were talking about that. And we know that as we speak, everybody's waiting for the chief prosecutor and the court to announce in terms of the request by the chief prosecutor for the court to give him a go-ahead for those warrants of arrest for the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, the leadership of Hamas, and the generals of the Israel Defense Force in relation to holding them accountable to the recent killings and the tension that started on October 7 up to now, where now thousands and thousands of Palestinians have been killed. So those are the two important issues. He also met the different heads of states, including Ireland, a friend to South Africa and New Zealand. But the other important engagement is today.
Yeah, absolutely. We understand it's going to be with the New York Stock Exchange. We'll be meeting with some business leaders in America as well. So we're looking forward to the outcomes of those gatherings. But a lot of the focus has been on the Summit of the Future, which actually is unfolding on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. A lot is hinging on this. It's hoped that this will essentially, what will come out of this pact is an ability to better respond to future crises. But the question is everybody on the continent happy with this pact?
Well, when you look at the first objection before it was adopted, you saw Russia putting an amendment that was supported by some countries in the West, the developing nations. And there was a counter from the DRC saying that there's no need for that amendment. But I can tell you, within the African group, this point of non-interference, it's a very, very thorny issue. And I think there will be countries that will support Russia on demanding the amendment, even though they might be drowned by the fact that it was presented, the position to endorse the pact as is by the African group. But it is going to raise serious doubts from countries that are always vocal in terms of saying that the West interference in the developing nations and other nations, it's something that should be dealt with. So I think there will still be a dissenting voice.
Right. The role that South Africa plays cannot be overstated. We know tomorrow President Cyril Ramaphosa will address the UN General Assembly. Any telling what the focus of his speech will be?
I think the president is going to talk about peace and security, taking from what the future summit key issue was in relation to maintenance of peace in the world, and the pact speaking to the transformation of the Security Council. Therefore, the president will talk about the key issue, peace and security, because without peace and security, there can't be development. The second issue will be a strong message in relation to the 2 seats for Africa, because we can't have the untransformed Security Council. After 1945, it was geared for big countries who were involved in the conflict, as if countries such as South Africa were not involved. We know that even our forefathers joined the First World War and the Second World War. I'm talking about black Africans on the continent, even though at times this is not being recognized. And therefore, the key issue here is the transformation of the Security Council. It has failed in its mandate, because if it was still relevant to the current political situation globally, we wouldn't be talking about the conflict in Ukraine. We wouldn't be talking about the standoff in the Middle East. As you saw, the recent time, Hezbollah and Israel and the entire region now engulfed in the fear in terms of peace and security. And I think he will also touch on how the world is prepared for next pandemic, and also issues that are related to global financial institutions that must transform, so that you can ensure that the developing countries are also part of a better world in terms of creating jobs for their people. And if you don't transform the financial system, you are not going to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. So much to be considered on that international stage. But, you know, a person who's really been a driver of that kind of global peace was Nelson Mandela, a man who needs no introduction. Reports that former International Relations Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor is set to take over as the chair of the Nelson Mandela Foundation from next month. What do we know about that?
Well, indeed, they've issued a statement, the foundation. I think she is the right person. As you look at the foundation, particularly the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the Nelson Mandela Foundation, they are more of a global project and institutions. And therefore, to have a person like Dr. Naledi Pandor, who has got strong strengths in terms of politics, national politics, strong interest in education, strong interest in women issues, and a global perspective, I can't see anyone who can be as relevant as Dr. Naledi Pandor, particularly during this critical time where the world is divided and there's no resolution to the current global tensions around the world, and also in the continent or on the continent. And I think Dr. Naledi Pandor, with her voice, you see now, she is not lost to the debate with a better platform.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, she is seen as somebody who spearheaded South Africa's petition to the Hague, right? Especially in that unprecedented case against Israel. But all of this, Sophie, gives us an opportunity to reflect on multilateralism generally and whether or not it's worked. And I imagine this is going to be a central question in some of these gatherings when we reach the other end of the General Assembly's 79th meeting.
Tomorrow, this is going to be a focus, whether this institution, the United Nations, is still up to the task and is still geared to resolving issues on the globe. Look at the development goals. As I see the Deputy Secretary there with the President, Amina Mohammed, we are lagging behind in meeting the development goals. That speaks to how the UN has been paralyzed. Then the issue of peace and security, and that is the Security Council's role. And as I pointed out, when it was formed after 1945, after the Second World War, replacing the League of Nations that had been paralyzed after the First World War, the Security Council right now, the resolutions to stop conflict, there's always veto power struggle between your America, your Russia, your China. And therefore, this is the time to really look at that. And unfortunately, much as the United States of America and others, some are supporting Africa to have these 2 seats, they don't want to give Africa veto power. Then what's the use? Because right now, Africa is in the Security Council as a rotational basis, and countries do rotate. They don't have veto power. The veto power is the issue. And I think there's a big battle to fight in terms of ensuring that Africa does take its rightful place, and other regions like Brazil, who are still excluded in the south, but make sure they have the same powers as the developed countries. Because when you look at the agenda of the Security Council, in most cases, you find developing countries on that agenda, and Africa in particular. So how do you discuss our problems when we are not part of it? Nothing about us without us, because you won't find a lasting solution.
It's not just about inclusion, it's about meaningful inclusion. Sophie
Exactly.
Mokoena, as always, thanks very much indeed for helping us understand these international issues with links, of course, to our own country and the region. Sophie Mokoena, our international news editor.